Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's regional authority president, was in the United States, visited, I think, met with House Leader McCarthy in California last week. That was very controversial. She was met with protests in New York, as she was also making a stop here. And then she, I think, made in between, was traveling around Central America, ended up at the last with Mr. McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, the House Leader now. And now China, of course, has done what it did during Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, where she met with Tsai Ing-wen. They're conducting pretty intense military drills right now surrounding the island, conducting targeted moves on Taiwan. And so what do you make of this latest escalation, Brian? Because one of the things that the United States is so angry about with France is that France reiterated its commitment to the One China principle very vocally and loudly, even stating, I think Macron said something to the effect of, not really our problem. I don't see any reason to believe you're going to do anything rash with Taiwan, so not really our issue. But it feels like what's going on now is that the United States, despite whatever rhetoric has come out of the Biden White House around its commitment to One China, this move seems to be the latest in a series of supporting separatism. Because the more and more that the White House, that Congress reinforces the notion that Tsai Ing-wen is a rightful state-to-state leader, the more it reinforces this message that the U.S. stands on the side of Taiwan independence, and that's China's red line. So the closer it feels like we're getting to confrontation.
Yeah, and I have to point this out every time we bring up this topic. On the U.S. State Department's official website, U.S. relations with Taiwan, it literally says they have a one China policy, which means there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China, and there's only one legitimate government of China, the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And they specifically say we don't recognize Taiwan's independence. And even Taiwan itself, the government is actually officially called the Republic of China. And in their constitution, it recognizes Taiwan as an island province that is part of China. And a lot of people don't understand that because the Western media deliberately leaves that out. They leave that out and they create the impression that Taiwan is somehow some sort of independent country. And I also have to point out, before we talk about what the U.S. is doing in regards to Taiwan, is that the illusion of some sort of autonomy or self-rule in Taiwan has been maintained for decades by the U.S. and the U.S. alone. Without the U.S. pouring in huge amounts of military and political support, there is no Taiwan the way it exists today. Its economy is dependent on the rest of China. And if China just stopped trading with Taiwan, that would cripple their economy and that would wreck their society. So that's up to all of that to keep in mind. Now, when you read the official U.S. policy regarding Taiwan, that it's not a country, they don't recognize its independence, they recognize Chinese sovereignty over it, but then they're meeting with Tsai Ing-wen and they're talking about putting troops on Taiwan and helping Taiwan fight. They admit that is an internal political affair of China. The UN recognizes it as such. They're openly talking about completely violating international law, and more specifically, the UN Charter. It's prohibition against interference in another nation's internal political affairs and upholding political independence of China, People's Republic of China. So think about that and think about how they constantly cry about Russia being in Ukraine and how hypocritical that is. And this is why it's very hard for the rest of the world that is signing up for multipolarism. This is part of the reason they are signing up for multipolarism. It's impossible to take the U.S. seriously. And what they're demonstrating is they don't care about anything except what they want, and whatever they want, they're going to shape international law to achieve it, even if it means completely deforming international law in the process. And that's what they've been doing, to the point where this system doesn't even work anymore. It doesn't even make sense anymore. And no one knows what the US is going to do next. They don't know if they're going to seize their assets, put sanctions on them, blow their infrastructure up. They have no idea. I mean, they're hostages to the unpredictable nature of the US. And that seems to be what the US had economic and military might that is waning. So they're falling back on, we talked about deception, but also creating a dangerous and unpredictable foreign policy that kind of terrorizes everybody back in line. So that's what they're doing with Taiwan. And remember, the way they got Europe to go along with this proxy war was they triggered the proxy war in the first place. That's what kind of got them all lined up. And then they started nailing them to the wall by doing things like destroying Nord Stream. So they're trying to trigger a conflict over Taiwan. And it's going to be almost, you see the propaganda. You see them building consensus toward war with China. That's happening every day now, full blast. They want to get that conflict going. If they could get that conflict going, it's going to be almost impossible for Europe to say, no, we're not going along with the US on this. So, we just watched them go through the same process with Ukraine. So that's what they're trying. They're just repeating the whole process, but in regards to Taiwan, which is so much worse because Taiwan is not recognized by the UN as a country. It's recognized as Chinese territory. So it's that the US is literally fighting, is picking a fight with China by going into its territory and interfering.
Yeah, indeed. And regardless, we can talk all day probably about the US's commitments and its joint communiques. I mean, there's 3 of them to the One China principle, but the US always left open the possibility of playing all sides to this situation with the Taiwan Relations Act and its continued arming of Taiwan dating all the way back to the first joint communique during the Nixon-Kissinger visit. But I think when we look at that UN resolution you're talking about, Brian, 2758, I mean, that's just international law now. We're talking about China being one China, the People's Republic being the rightful representative to the world stage. And that's what is being trampled here. And one interesting thing I'd like your opinion on is, in the lead up to this visit from Tsai Ing-wen, you had Ma Ying-jeou, the former president of the regional authority of the KMT, when the KMT was in power from 2008 to 2016, visit China. And he visited multiple cities. He was very affirmative on the One China principle, talked about the choice being peace versus war and how Taiwan needs to choose peace and how all sides need to choose peace and that this is the future. One China is the future. Now, the KMT did really well November of last year in the regional local elections in Taiwan. Now 2024 is coming, and Tsai Ing-wen is due to, she won't run again because she's resigned, I believe, but she will, her party will. And I'm wondering what this all means, because it seemed like the issue of separatism and this issue of getting close to the United States was actually what was the problem for Tsai Ing-wen in the local elections in the DPP, her party. It's that they were so focused on China, on the dangers of China, that there wasn't a lot of talk, let's say, about the issues people may care about on the island.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've pointed out these 2013 polls that the U.S. government funded through USAID and the International Republican Institute in Ukraine. They did one in Crimea, and then more recently I found another 2013 poll that covered all of Ukraine. And when you look at what was going on a year before the U.S. overthrew the elected government in Ukraine, literal Nazis in power and their political allies, and kicked this whole process off, Ukraine was divided, and they were divided in a way where they spoke as much Russian as they spoke Ukrainian. They had an affinity towards Russia, but also Europe, and they wanted to enjoy the best of both worlds. The status quo was working for them, and what the U.S. did was they went in there and they knocked all of that over, and they forced them into a conflict where they were pitted against each other The country divided. Crimea decided to go back with Russia. Then the Donbas, Zaporozhye, Kherson, back to Russia. And so there's a very similar process taking place in Taiwan. It's a promising sign that the Democratic Progressive Party did so poorly in the local elections. But at the same time, the U.S. invests huge amounts of money to manipulate public perception, both in Ukraine and also on the island province of Taiwan. They put huge amounts of money into that. And they also encourage the Democratic Progressive Party to suppress alternative views, to shut down media, to put pressure on anyone trying to say anything reasonable. And that has an impact on people's perception. And then when they go to vote or you conduct a poll, their minds have been manipulated to go along with an agenda that's actually completely in contradiction to their own best interests. So we have to always keep that in mind. But when you really think about it, Ma Ying-jeou, he knows that Taiwan is going to end up being the next Ukraine. I think a lot of people on Taiwan right now realize that, and they can see where this is all going. And if you doubt that, just read the policy papers that the U.S. government funds that are coming out about a potential war with China over Taiwan. And they talk about, well, if China doesn't destroy the ports and airports, we'll destroy them so that they can't use it. And if we have to, we will completely destroy their semiconductor industry because we don't want China to get their hands on that. And there were representatives in Taiwan that actually had to come out and say, no, you don't have to do that. I mean, aren't there other ways we can make sure that they don't get their hands on it other than destroying it? But that's what the U.S. is going to do. And if you see what they're doing with the semiconductor industry, they're trying to coerce Taiwan to basically hand it over to the U.S., and they're going to get cut out of the picture. So they're stripping the island of anything of value, and they're preparing to just feed it into a proxy war against China. The goal is to get that conflict going. Perhaps try to humiliate China because they have this big plan on confounding any sort of invasion. And they also have plans on a naval blockade around the globe to stop maritime shipping going to and from China. And what they hope is they can destroy the economy, destabilize China politically, and achieve regime change, and then the division and destruction of China, just like they're openly saying they want to do with Russia. And they've actually tried to do to Russia. So this is what's at stake, and we have to keep an eye on all of these moving pieces because there are definitely people in Taiwan who realize this. They may not want reunification right away, but they want to stay on that path. And Kuomintang, they were actually on the path toward a very incremental, slow, mutually beneficial reunification, focus on economics and building economic ties that benefit everyone on both sides of the strait. And the U.S. deliberately interrupted that and installed the DPP into power. And now we see where it's all gone. It's on the path toward war. And now it's a matter of people trying to avoid that while you have the U.S. pouring gasoline on this fire that they've started.
Yeah, the U.S. is very open about this. On the political side, they try to play all sides, right? Biden and you have now a different Congress. So Congress is definitely more, how should I say, openly anti-China in a lot of ways, at least rhetorically. But when it comes to Taiwan, no matter which politician you speak to on any side, there's massive support for separatism in one respect. And then there's also talking, that you will find lip service to the One China agreements, all of that. But on the other hand, I think more significantly is what you said. You have these military industrial complex funded U.S. government backed think tanks, whether it's a Center for Strategic International Studies, whether it's a Center for a New American Security. You have these think tanks conducting war simulations, talking about what would happen. I did a piece a while back ago, I believe it was a couple months ago, on the flurry. I believe it was right after the new year. There was just a flurry of publications in the Western media about how Ukraine has taught us a lot of lessons about Taiwan. It was in Foreign Policy magazine. There were also other reports. about how now Taiwan needs to be the next Ukraine. But now I want to show a video, Brian. Michael McCall, he sits on the he's a chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs now, Republican, now that they've kind of changed guard in Congress, in the House specifically. But I want to play this video. I think it's interesting because it gets to this point, right? You had Mark, I believe it was Minahan, right? One of the top generals in the Air Force, talk about open war. Sorry about that. Talk about open war with Taiwan, in Taiwan with China over Taiwan. So you've had this Bierman talk about war with China, but here's Michael McCall, who's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Here's what he had to say about Taiwan.
So Speaker McCarthy and yourself have said that multiple times now, that we need to arm Taiwan now before there's any sort of invasion. What about U.S. troops?
I think, then you're talking about an authorized use of military force that would come out of my committee, or a declaration of war, which we haven't utilized since World War II.
Would you support that?
I think if China, Communist China, invades Taiwan, I think that is certainly, if the American people support this, the Congress will follow.
House Foreign Affairs Chairman.
So there you go. I mean, if you want to know the mentality of the top head honcho, the top dog at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, that's what he thinks, Mr. Michael McCall. What's your impression of that? What's your reaction?
It's just all 100% full tilt war propaganda. If communist China invade, the U.S. officially recognizes Taiwan as part of China, so it's not an invasion. Whatever goes on between Taiwan and the rest of China, that is an internal political affair. And so he's framing it as if China is invading a sovereign nation, when even the U.S. officially does not recognize Taiwan as such, and neither does the UN. And he'll be the same one out of the other side of his mouth talking about Russia violating Ukraine's sovereignty, while openly promoting the idea of going to war with China over Taiwan, that is recognized under international law as Chinese territory. It's just more of the same with what the U.S. does. And you just mentioned foreign policy and some of these other publications. This is all exactly what they were doing in regards to Syria. And I guess the hope is that if they couldn't even pull off Syria, they won't be able to pull off, say, Ukraine or Taiwan. And that's the only thing we can hope, is that and I've said it many times before, the mentality creating this, the premise in the first place that we need to do this so China doesn't surpass the West. Despite China having 4 times the population, graduating millions of engineers more every year than the U.S., having several times the industrial capacity of the U.S. and the EU, despite all of these things, China cannot be allowed to surpass us. That premise makes no sense. It is detached from reality. It is fundamentally immoral. It is fundamentally wrong. It's also illogical and impractical, even if you don't care about morality and trying to arrest the development of an entire nation of over 1 billion people. So when you start with a flawed premise, everything you build on top of it is going to be skewed further and further away from reality. And so with that's why when they do things like a proxy war against the Syrian government, or this conflict in Ukraine, or this war they're trying to provoke over Taiwan, that's why when you start looking at the details, it doesn't make any sense, and there's so many disconnects. Like, you're waging this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, but you don't have enough artillery rounds to do it. I mean, that's something you should have known from the very beginning, and yet they went along with it anyway. And it's going to be the same issue with China. And it seems to me, and I know we've said this before many times, it seems to me that they had this big plan and they ran out of time. The window of opportunity is closing faster than they thought it would. They're less prepared than they thought they would be. And they're just throwing anything that they can at the wall, hoping something sticks, which is extremely dangerous, because we're talking about war between multiple nuclear armed powers.
Yeah. And when Mr. Michael McCall said authorization of use of force, I mean, that I mean, it's just fantasy in a lot of ways, because first off, I think I think that clip didn't do it justice. I think he also said that if the American people support it and if Congress supports it, then we'll do it. Well, what does it even mean for the American people to support anything the U.S. does when it comes to foreign policy? Because the United States public, the U.S. public, does not vote on foreign policy. It doesn't. It may be influenced to vote in certain ways for politicians, but it doesn't vote for the decisions. And that's a huge deal in the sense that there's just carte blanche. So.
What they'll do is they'll do a poll like with Ukraine, and what they will do, and what we've seen them do is, like, say regarding Russia, they spent years generating hatred toward Russia through Russiagate, which was a complete fabrication. And I believe the sole purpose of that was to generate hatred toward Russia. There, the U.S., you have left, you have right, but in reality, they all answer to the same special interest. They all know that there may be certain types of competition taking place, but it's not the zero-sum game that people think it is. It's like people doing pro wrestling. They know it's a script. They know who's giving them their paycheck. They may have personal ambitions to be, play a better role in the script, but beyond that, no. And it's the same thing with this. They have been, and they are putting it on full blast, generating consensus for war against China. The racism is being fully encouraged. The racism, the lies, the fabrications, everything we've seen them do ahead of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and the proxy war against Russia, they're doing that now with China. So when it comes time to see what the American people think, their minds are going to be so poisoned by this endless propaganda that, of course, they're going to support U.S. war with. And you know what the U.S. will desperately try to do is get a U.S. ship sunk on purpose so that they can say, because they know that that'll be a hot button. They know a lot of Americans are already incredibly racist against China, insecure about the fact that China is surpassing them. And all they need to see is U.S. service members again, victims of their own U.S. government, actually, but the American people will not see that. And we've seen town hall meetings where they're complaining about some Chinese business setting up a factory or something in the U.S. These people are out of their minds and detached from reality because they're having their minds filled with propaganda by the political leadership, who are also completely out of their minds and detached from reality.
Right. It's pretty obvious that the number one issue economically for the ordinary worker in the United States is U.S. corporations, U.S. financial institutions. But then you do have this stark reality of the United States is sailing warships in the Taiwan Straits seemingly multiple times per week. And you also have, as you said, Brian, you have guys like Michael McCaul saying these things, and they're backed up by real policy. And what Michael McCaul spoke of there when she asked about troops, the reporter, if we can call her that, the reporter on Fox News, when she asked him about troops, he didn't mention that the United States has already been slowly, very gradually, but pretty significantly, even in the last month or so, increasing troop presence in Taiwan, increasing arms expenditures. I think Biden just quadrupled. It was a small number. It's going from like a dozen to maybe like 48, 50 something. So quadrupling the troop presence there. I mean, this is happening. So for all of the bluster, I feel like this is more hubris to use authorization of use of force. Yeah, we'll go in full scale. But the foundations for this are being built as we speak. And I think that's just as significant as Michael McCaul just saying something so wildly unbelievable, right? The idea that Congress will vote on this and, this is going to be some kind of military operation on the scale of Iraq. But at the same time, the rudiments are being built for such a conflict.
Well, if the U.S. ever does vote to go to war, I think it would be for going to war against China, because they do see this as such a huge threat and something that is so unacceptable. And again, it is a larger country the larger population, larger industrial base, it only makes sense that it surpasses the US. There's nothing rational at all about what they're saying and what they're doing. But if that was what they had to do to rally all, like a 9/11 moment, to rally all Americans together to get this done, I wouldn't put anything past them at this point, because if they fail, if they don't get their conflict, 2025 comes, they didn't get their conflict, things are just the status quo, whatever it happens to be, and the status quo is now changing gradually, actually quite quickly when you really think about it. If they don't get this done by then, they're not ever going to get it done. The disparity between China and the US militarily and economically, that gap is closing, and then it's going to start widening again, and it's going to be widening entirely in China's favor. And how is the US going to be able to do anything then? And I suspect that China, the US has US troops on Taiwan, an island province that the US officially recognizes as Chinese territory. Think about how provocative that is. An act of war. And yet China has not reacted, because they know that in 5-10 years, no matter how big the US makes that force, eventually they're going to get it off. They're going to sweep it out off of the island. Eventually it's going to happen. And they just want to be patient. They want to avoid a catastrophic conflict that could jeopardize all of the progress that they've made as a nation, as a civilization. So they're trying to avoid that, and they're trying to let the clock time out. And the U.S. is desperate for some sort of conflict before that happens. So that's what we see. And I don't think we should underestimate through what lengths the U.S. will go to try to get this going, because like I said, once the window of opportunity closes, and it may already have closed, there's nothing they can do to reverse it.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.